My name is Lita. I'm the Creative Director at Deeproot. Today, Jim Urban will be discussing minimizing the use of salts and other chemicals in the landscape. The goal of the webinar is to try to make designers aware of best practices around chemical applications and to help them understand when they need to be concerned and when they need to call in the experts. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that we will be recording the webinar, and a link to it will be included in a follow-up email that will go out to everyone later this afternoon. Attendees will be muted throughout the presentation, which will last about 45 minutes, and there will be time at the end for questions. Please submit any questions you have at any time during the presentation using the Q&A box in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. I will then speak them aloud at the end of the presentation so that everyone can hear Jim's responses. So with that, we will begin.
Okay. So am I connected now, Lita?
You are. Yeah, you just need to put your presentation in full screen mode, and then we'll be good to go. Perfect.
Does that look good?
It looks great.
Great. Okay. Well, hello, everybody. So we're going to talk about all kinds of different chemicals today, as much as we can cram into this. Typically, for any one of these chemicals, a PhD person would spend practically their entire career on it. So we're going to try to do in 45 minutes about 20 PhD level ideas. So it means we're going to actually be in 101 minus on most of these ideas. But the thesis of this is that you can't have a soil scientist on every project, and you've got to be able to make some basic decisions as you're going through the process of building and maintaining and working on these kinds of landscapes. So we're basically going to be talking about chemicals mostly in the soil. And to do that, of course, we need to understand the critical aspects of soil, and we're not going to talk about that because we already have on other webinars. But keep in mind that there are these multiple parts of the soil, and a particular chemical may only impact one or two or three parts of that diagram, and that may be all it takes to have an impact on plants. So we're really talking about impact of chemicals on plants. So we take that diagram and we start throwing urban problems at it, like compaction and grading and drainage problems. And I've highlighted the chemical issues that we're going to talk about today in yellow, and then took salt and showed that salt can impact basically three of those bubbles, possibly density also, but the big impacts of salt are structure, big impact on the soil biology, and also depending on what kind of chemical you use to create the salt problem, it can have a rising pH problem. And so that kind of gives you an idea of the cross-section of what any one of these may or may not do. So one of my observations, if you will, and for all the landscape architects will have to forgive me again, but the question is, do landscape architects overthink the importance of chemistry in the success of plants? But at the same time, do we make broad assumptions about plants that are not based on understanding of chemistry or reading of the available literature on the topic? And I believe that each of these mistakes can lead to bad decisions in everything from concept and communication, design, details, specifications, project management. And ultimately, some of those assumptions about chemistry can lead to plant failure for reasons that have very little to do with chemistry. When we think about chemistry and plants, we generally focus in on this set of elements. with our base oxygen, hydrogen, carbon coming out of the air and the water. Think about those as the food that the plant uses to build new parts of the plant. And then there are these 14 essential nutrients elements, which you should think about as a vitamin and not a food. They're small little pieces of chemistry that allow the plant to do certain things. The question is, how important is this page to the overall success of any given plant? And my friend Kim Coder developed this chart where he started looking at the literature and what was killing plants or affecting plants, and somehow developed this occurrence of priority of stress. And the fatter and longer the line, the greater the intensity and degree of the problem, and the short little thin lines have very little intensity to them. And you can see that the physical issues with soil have a huge impact on the success or failure of the plant. The above ground issues of light and temperature have another big impact. And all of the soil chemistry actually has much, much smaller pieces, especially if you take out nitrogen, which I think we all understand is important. The rest of them have fairly little to practically no impact on the plant. But then we get down to soil pH, and we see that pH, as part of the chemistry equation, has almost as big an impact as nitrogen. And then on the lower part of his diagram, he went through and looked at all the human activities that impact plants. And those 3 bars that represent chemistry, again, are very, very small. And the salt bar is pretty small. That may be because the vast majority of the country or the human activity in the United States is not in salt spewing areas. You know, the majority of us want to live in warmer climates where we don't have to deal with winter as much, and that might be the reason why salt is not such a big problem in Kim Coder's world, who happens to practice at the University of Georgia. Then there are all these other bad chemicals that we're always hearing about, lead and carcinogenic things, and a whole host of bad chemicals. But then when I start looking at those chemicals and what their impacts on plants are, I find that they're very, very limited. And that's because the amount of most chemicals that it takes, and this is chemicals outside of the 14 essential nutrients, in order to affect a plant, they have to be in parts per thousand. For example, salt has to be in parts per thousand before it begins to impact the plant, where human health risks on most of these chemicals start in parts per million. And so most of the discussion about chemicals in the soil and impacts on the environment are really about health risks to people, fish, waterways, other things. We actually find that plants are very good phytoremediators. Most plants will actually pick up some of these really bad chemicals, particularly heavy metals and some hydrocarbons, and absorb them into their cells, locking them up. So the plants tolerate these other chemicals quite well. So let's move into salt as the one that most people are concerned about, especially as we get ready to head into winter. And part of the reason for this particular webinar today was because last winter in the northern parts of the U.S., especially the northeastern parts of the U.S., we had a terrible winter, huge amounts of salt laid down, and we had lots and lots of tree death in our cities, especially up in the northern tier of the U.S. But salt is not just a winter problem. Salts can be a problem anywhere in the U.S. The dry parts of the Southwest have salt problems, which are caused by different reasons. when we start talking about salt, we have to understand that there are two kinds of salt impacts on plants. And one is soil water salt, where the salt is put down on the ground, or however it gets there. It is dissolved into water, gets transmitted into the soil, and begins to affect the root system of the tree. But we also have airborne salts, where the salt is put down on the roadway in particular, or being atomized by ocean waves, and then blown onto the plant, coating the stems and affecting the part of the plant above the ground. Each of these two types of salt have different impacts on the plant. They express themselves differently. And we know that plants might be sensitive to waterborne salts, but not sensitive to air. And some may be sensitive to airborne salts and not sensitive to waterborne salts. And there are actually, according to Michael Durr, very few plants that are tolerant of both of these. So you really have to know what it is you're talking about. And unfortunately, Michael's, in his book, is not as complete about which plants fall in which category. And you really need to sort of look at local knowledge and your own personal knowledge on that particular aspect. So the salt in the air we'll address pretty quickly. It's pretty obvious in the northern parts of the U.S. where we spray a lot of salt on the road. You see it on your cars. And it coats the twigs and literally burns the cell layers on the outside of buds, and those twigs die or leaf out late, or in the case of this tree on the side of the road, had to essentially put out a whole new set of twigs from inside the interior of the plant. And you'll see that the twigs that are on the roadside of the plant have constantly been burned off, where the ones on the downwind side of the tree have a little bit better chance of success. I thought this picture of Hawaii was pretty interesting. So it's a big surf day, and big surf in Hawaii is huge. And we're half a mile inland on the coast road, and the road looks foggy, but it's not fog. It's actual salt drifting inland, coming off of those ocean waves. So the salt begins to mist into the air somewhere between 30 and 40 miles an hour. About the time when you're driving down the road and you're going to turn on your windshield wipers and turn on the windshield squirters to clean off your windshield, because the car ahead of you is starting to make your windshield dirty with this salt that's getting on your car. So low-speed roads, particularly in retail environments where the speeds are typically below 30 miles an hour, generally don't have this kind of salt damage, where high-speed roads I've seen along interstate highways with a salt drift can go several hundred yards off of the road, affecting plants a long way downwind from the road. Last year in Chicago, they had a really big salt year. This is along Lakeshore Drive, and the salt burn kill of plants that were closest to the fast part of the road and the downwind side of the road was much greater, and even just a few hundred feet off of the road, the plants started to look better and better. As you walk further and further from the road, plants look better. And you also notice that on these salt, air salt, it's usually the outer branches that get killed first, and then as the tree begins to flush back out, it'll flush from the inside out. This results in witch's brooms, or in these honey locusts. And the honey locusts are pretty tolerant of salt, airborne salt. It doesn't kill the tree, but it does affect the way the branches grow, so that you can see in the close-up photo a lot of tip dieback with resprouting right behind that, making for a branch form that you can see from pretty good distance on these honey locusts that are right next to the highway. When I was preparing for this lecture, I was in Phil Krall's book, which is, I think, 1998, I think is when his book was printed. And he has these very same trees in his book. And the picture was taken 25 years later, or 20 years later. They're still there. They're getting thicker and thicker as they're sort of like a self-pruning. But it was interesting to compare this photo from the photo of the same set of trees in Phil Krall's book. So let's move on to the water that gets into the soil. So salt is put down on the street, salt's put down in front of the stores, and a lot of that snow is shoveled from both directions and placed in the tree planting space. That snow melts and runs into the soil and can be very damaging to trees. The picture on the right is a project where they had a lot of death of trees all over this retail environment. And there was one set of trees that had a little tiny raised curve for some reason around it. They were scattered around the community. I have no idea why the design was different, but it was. And just that 1-inch curve that was able to deflect some of the runoff meant that every tree that was in a raised curve, out of about 300 trees, there were about 50 in raised curves. They all survived, looked great. The ones that were on the flush curve with the tree grade around it, almost every one of them died. So it was a very, very stark difference between just a little bit of effort to keep the water out, the salt-laden water out of the spaces. When you have the salt gets into the soil, sometimes it will just kill the tree outright in really heavy doses, but in lighter doses, the net effect of the salt is to reduce the tree's ability to uptake water. And so the damage to the tree looks very much like drought damage that you would expect to find with the tree. Essentially, the outer leaves dying first because you just can't get the water up there, and this very classic margin edge burn that you would see in drought or with the salt affecting the tree. So last winter we had fairly large tree losses throughout many of our northern cities. I've been looking at 2 of them. One is Chicago, and the winter kill seems to be confined mostly to the smaller, more recently planted trees, although there are some larger trees that have died. And so the question is, was it salt? And these trees get salted every year. Was it just that it was that much colder? But a lot of these were trees that are pretty reliably cold tolerant. The maple trees, for example, are very cold tolerant. We didn't get close to their limit of cold. Was it poor drainage that wasn't letting the salt out? Really hard to figure out exactly why these trees died. And unfortunately, there hasn't been the rigorous review of exactly why the trees died. We just don't have that kind of money and time. We're spending all our time just replacing trees. Toronto had pretty much the same problem. They had a street, Bloor Street, which coincidentally is in silvicells. Almost all that pavement has got silvicells under it. They lost about 1/3 of the trees to outright death. About 1/3 of the trees leafed out very sporadically, and 1/3 of them leafed out reasonably well across the canopy of the tree, although none of them looked really great. And at first we thought it might be the salt running off into the tree pits. But a lot of the trees that died or were suffered from partial dieback were in raised planters. This tree on the left is a raised planter. It's a very large planter, raised about 8 inches off of the ground. Very hard to get the ice and the snow in there. The perennials that they planted in the spring all grew just fine. They're not showing any kind of salt issues. So question again, is it salt? Is it plane tree is not the right tree for Toronto? And we know that we have very large soil volumes here. We know they're draining really well. So a lot of confusion, but people are sort of pointing the fingers at salt, and maybe that is a big part of the problem. But usually when a tree dies, it's not just one thing. It's a combination of things that one would have to look at. So when you're trying to say, okay, what kind of salt am I getting? You're going to send your soil off for a soil test, and you can either get it done by the saturated paste method or the 1-to-1 soil to water method. Different labs do it differently, and they're going to give you different results. And it's important to know that each of those different techniques will give you different results, with the saturated paste giving you slightly higher numbers than the 1-to-1 soil to water. But generally, if you write in your specifications that 2 decimons per meter is the upper limit of what you would accept, you should be okay for most plants. Just a little bit about the terminology. The DS/M, decimons per meter, is a measure of electroconductivity, and as a scale issue, 2 DSM compares to seawater at 5,400 DSM. So we're not talking a lot of salt in the water, in the soil, to begin to affect plants. This is further compounded in some of your older text, uses mmHO per centimeter. It's a milliohms per centimeter. And it's the same number as DSM. They just changed the title of it to protect the innocent, I think. And then finally, some of your really old texts will use parts per million, where about 600 to 1,000 is a good upper limit, but you certainly can go to 2,000 on many plants and be okay with the salt. It's important to know that when you take salt tests, if you take them in the early spring, you're going to get one set of numbers, and if you wait until the plants start having problems and you say get around to June and you're taking your soil test, you may find that they don't show much salt, because salt is very, very soluble and can wash out of the upper soil layers pretty quickly. So I've had projects where we were pretty sure salt was the problem, but yet the salt doesn't show up because we're not brought in until the summer when there are problems. We get there, we take our soil test, and we say, oh, not a lot of salt here. Just a visual impact of what happens as you start increasing your electroconductivity. And you can still grow plants. They're almost 4, but they're definitely going to show problems. And we start, in this case, killing these soybean plants by the time we got to 8 decimons. So what are the alternatives that we can do? Often you don't get to control the kind of salt that goes down. A lot of discussion about potassium chloride as the good salt. And yeah, it's better, but it's still salt. If I had my choice, I would use potassium chloride. But some of these newer other ideas that we're using may actually be better. The salt brine that we put down ahead of the storm puts down far less salt and seems to do a pretty good job, and we're starting to see more and more of that on large highways. There's a whole family of organic snow melting products, from beet juice to sugars to various other products that people are promoting that do a pretty good job. And then just basic sand or grit on the road, which obviously has its downsides. It's a pretty messy idea. And in Seattle, they discovered that the sand was causing more problems with salmon habitat than salt, because the salt washed through when the salmon weren't there, but the sand filled up all the pores in the gravel on the roadsides and really cut down on the spawning habitat for salmon. We also have to remember that fertilizer is a salt. You can actually just put down urea fertilizer on your sidewalk and it will melt the snow. So when you're buying fertilizer, it would be good to look for what's called the fertilizer salt index. And if that number is 25 or below, it's reasonable. But when you look at this long list of various kinds of fertilizers, you're going to find there are very few of them that have a low salt index, especially when you get to nitrogen. There aren't any nitrogen fertilizers that have a really low salt index. But organic fertilizers, compost, for example, typically are low in salt and can do a very good job of increasing nitrogen, particularly in planting beds. So you may want to be thinking about organic fertilizers over other kinds of fertilizers. So the most talked about method of dealing with winter salt, if you can't control the amount of salt, is flushing the salt out of the soil. And it's a nice thing to say, but it's really hard to do. So these pictures of people with small garden hoses putting water on the tree, it's a good way of watering the tree to keep it alive, but it's not you're not going to get nearly enough water on that system to flush out the salt. You need at least 2 inches of water put over the entire root zone of the soil, and doing that when, for example, in Toronto where we have silvicells, we've got to put that water into the water harvesting system, which is an interesting problem. In salty areas, the water harvesting systems that we're starting to talk about are great in the summer, but they also conduct the salt into the soil. So maybe we need to start thinking about, for those areas, a water harvesting system that can be closed off or valved off in the wintertime and then reopened in the summer. And then a lot of fresh water flushed in there. There's also some discussion in the literature about flushing the canopies to get rid of the air salt. A much more problematic thing to do. And I haven't found anything that really shows its effectiveness, although it's talked about enough that I suspect it probably is reasonably effective. But all of this, the flushing of the canopy and the flushing of the soil, has to be done before the tree leaves out. It's very critical that it be done during that short window between the last frost, the last salt event, and the tree leaf out, which might only be 4 or 5 weeks in some areas. So you can see that we're asking cities to do an awful lot of effort in a very, very short amount of time. So these aren't particularly practical on a large scale. You'll find stuff in the literature about adding gypsum to the soil to reduce the exchangeable sodium in the soil, and this does work, but you need to understand all the pros and cons. I found a really good piece on this at the informedgardener.com, which is out of the University of Washington. So a good discussion on gypsum, and that particular website is full of lots and lots of, I think, very reliable, from when I looked at it, and easy to understand information on a wide range of plant issues. So you might put that particular website on your tickle list or on your favorites list as a go-to place for plant problems. One of the things you'll see on this chart is that the fine-grained soils need a lot more gypsum than the coarse-grained soils to do the same thing. And we'll talk about this fine-grained, coarse-grained issue in a minute. In arid regions where we're irrigating soil, we can also have salt problems. We irrigate the soil. We only put enough in the upper root zone to keep the plant healthy. There isn't enough rain to actually flush anything through the soil. Then that water evaporates, and any salts that will be in that water will stay in the upper part of the soil and can build up to very, very high layers. A lot of us are using reclaimed sewage water for irrigation. That has a lot of can have a lot of salt in it. And the only way to really solve it is by periodic flood irrigation. And that could even be with the reclaimed water because the reclaimed water only has a little bit of salt in it, and we're going to flush a whole lot through. Even though we're using a salty water, it's not a high salt water. It's the accumulation of each irrigation event contributing small amounts of salt that build up to levels that are a problem. And these levels can come quite high. This is in Arizona. No, this is Las Vegas. You can see by that tree the little drip emitter, and underneath of it is a pool of salt that's developed in this high intense heat, essentially just pulling all the salt up to the surface and right into the root zone of the tree. As we increase the salt levels in the soil, it will begin to break down the soil structure, tearing apart the bonds that hold the clay and silt and sticks everything together. We also damage the soil structure. Fungal communities that are living in the soil are lost. And the soil begins to collapse in on itself, making it drain at a much poorer rate and not growing roots quite as well. In the far extremes, we have the salt flats, which is where if you take anything to extremes, it's amazing what happens. And the Bonneville salt flats are most famous. But you'll find salt flats all over the arid Southwest. This is the salt marshes on the east side of Las Vegas. And they're not really salty looking, but these are all very, very high tolerant salt plants that we could use. The soil down there below the salt flat is actually a pretty good soil. If you dealt with the salt, that would be an excellent soil to use for other purposes, but you'd have to flush it really well. So that concludes salt. Now we're going to move on to some of the other things that we have to deal with, and we'll move into pH. Most of us think of chlorotic plants when we think about elevated pH, but there are an awful lot of look-alike other soil chemical toxicities that we need to begin to think about when you just look at the plant and see that it's going chlorotic. It may not necessarily simply be a high pH situation. What happens with pH is there's this zone in between the red bars where almost all of the important chemical elements are able to be uptaken by the plant. And once we get above about 7.3, the amount of the ability of the plant to uptake, particularly copper, zinc, iron, and manganese, drops off rather dramatically. And so that's why many of these soils look chlorotic, because they can't uptake these important elements, iron in particular. And at the low end, the same thing happens. The copper, zinc, boron, phosphorus, molybdenum become very difficult for the plant to uptake, and other problems happen down once you get below about 4.5. So that's the rationale for staying within a certain pH range. This is the USDA soil classifications for different kinds of acidity. In Michael Durr's book, he often will refer to a plant as being pH tolerant, but in the book it doesn't really say what that means. So I called Michael and got a clarification on that. And he thinks a pH tolerant plant is anything that will survive between 4.5 and 7.3, which is a huge range. I never would have guessed it that big. And he goes, well, the plants don't really show severe problems when you're within that range for the plants he says are pH tolerant. Now, they might not win the Chelsea Flower Show, but they'll still be alive. The average person will think that they look pretty good. The point on pH is it's very difficult to change pH, particularly lowering pH, which is the biggest problem we have most often. So I need you to pick plants that are suitable for the pH, and Michael Durr's book is very good on that. So follow his instructions and pick plants that are right for the pH that you have. Now, as we build our cities, we're all the time raising the pH. Most of the building materials that we use are alkaline. Our fertilizers are often alkaline, and our salts, the things that are producing salts, are somewhat alkaline. So we're gradually raising the pH in our soils in our cities, and we need to become very aware of that and picking plants that can tolerate high pH. Even if you're in an area where the native plants like acidic soils, you move into the city, you're not dealing with a native soil, you're probably dealing with a high pH soil, and you should adjust the plant palette. So let's move on to the plant required chemicals and talk about their deficient and toxic levels. This is this little collection at the bottom of Kim Coder's chart that I showed earlier. And we normally talk about nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, but you'll see that phosphorus is way down on the list of priorities. And that's because phosphorus is not very water soluble. It's pretty stable in the soil, so it's hard to get rid of it. So we generally don't find a lot of phosphorus deficient soils. But our potassium and nitrogen, which are both water soluble, are a problem both for plants and also becoming a problem for waterways. So we've got to be thinking about those chemicals. So the ones up on the top of the list here, those top 5 or 6 categories are the ones that we need to spend the most amount of time thinking about. So most of us will send tests off to soil labs, and I think this is a very important step. A couple of things I wanted to point out on this particular lab report. And the first is always make sure you check the box for pH. That's probably the most important box you can check. You'll see below that buffer pH, which has to do to calculate how much lime you would put on the soil to raise the pH. Generally, I kind of ignore that one because I'm never trying to raise the pH unless I'm growing turf. The red box soluble salts, you'll see in this one I didn't check because I had no indication of both where this project was and the way plants were growing on the site that I had a soluble salt problem, so I didn't feel like paying that extra money. And often you'll see a box to check for nitrogen, and I will see specifications that require you have a certain amount of nitrogen, or you should check nitrogen. The problem is you can't really test for nitrogen. You can test for nitrate, but it's such an ephemeral chemical. It's coming and going. that the soil testing labs that I talk about say they put that test in there just to keep their customers satisfied because they asked for it, but they know it doesn't mean anything. The more critical number is this one by the orange box, which is the ENR. It's the estimated nitrogen release, which is a formula that comes off the organic matter. So organic matter is essentially what's helping nitrogen change from gas nitrogen in the soil gases into a usable nitrogen for the plant. So that's really the number. If you're looking at nitrogen, that's the number you should be looking at. Generally, the plants do pretty well even at very low numbers. You should check your plants. That's kind of a broad statement. I admonish us not to make broad statements, but and we can usually add fertilizers to pick up the soil and bring those very low numbers up. It's a pretty easy thing to mess with those numbers and bring them up. The very high numbers are really hard to bring down, and I put a yellow box by manganese. In the mid-Atlantic area, we're starting to see a lot of manganese toxicity that's starting at around 400 parts per million. And it comes off of the mulch that we're using, we found out. That a lot of our mulch is made from tulip poplars, because we have a lot of tulip poplar forests that we're tearing down to build home sites and development. Those trees are ground up into mulch. And it turns out that tulip poplar is a very high manganese accumulator, so it's sucking manganese out of the soil, goes into the wood, we grind it up, the wood decomposes, and it gets deposited into the soil that we're mulching. And we've had instances of plants actually going into decline and dying because of very, very high manganese in the soil. That may be a regional thing to the mid-Atlantic area where we have so many tulip poplars, but just as an example of how the unintended consequences of something that we think might be a good thing to do. So while we're concerned with what the amount of chemicals that may be in the soil, what we also need to know is how well can that soil hold on to those chemicals. And that's a function of a number in this thing. You can see up in the upper right-hand corner the calculated cation exchange capacity, which in this soil is 8.8, which is fairly low. Anything below 10 is starting to be a little low, and 5 is very low. But it's basically how can the soil particles hold on to those elements. And the chemistry behind this is pretty complex, but Bill Fountain gave me this little idea that the soil particle is like a bus, and it has all these seats on it which are negatively charged. Every seat in the bus has to be occupied all the time. So hydrogen, which is a very weak but very common element, occupies the sites. An element like nitrogen, the NH4 molecules floating around the water, it wants to attach itself to one of those sites. It kicks one of those weak hydrogen molecules off the bus and takes its seat. It exchanges places. So it's the ability of the soil to have enough sites to exchange for the chemicals that we want to hold. Thus the name cation exchange capacity. When we look at a soil particle, so here's a sand particle. It has a surface area of only 0.24 millimeters, very small. The amount of sites that are possible to put on that surface area are small because the surface area is small. But as I make the soil particles smaller and smaller, by the time I get to clay, I find I can have 1 million pieces of clay in each particle of sand. And by the time I unwrap each of those particles and look at their surface area, I find I have 24 millimeters of soil, of surface area in that same volume that I only got 0.24 millimeters So you can see that my possibility of exchange sites goes way up. And so fine-grained soils can hold on to chemicals and be more fertile than large-grained soils. Thus, why we need to have a certain amount of fine grain particles in our soil. Compost can do the same thing. Compost also has a very high cation exchange capacity, and so having compost in the upper layers of the soil is also very good. The other thing that can impact how well the chemicals may stay in the soil has to do with this surface interface. So I have a fine-grained soil on a coarse-grained soil. The water backs up on the soil interface and drains down very, very slowly. While it's draining down slowly, there's more of an opportunity for soil particles, salt particles, iron particles to come to rest on the soil interface or become attached to the particles of soil above it. This can be a good thing for the particles that we're trying to, the elements we're trying to maintain. It can be a bad thing if we're trying to get rid of those and wash through those particular elements. So we're going to end with a few other chemicals. Roundup, for example, doesn't stay in the soil or becomes inert before it can cause any problems. But if you read the label, you'll see that in sandy soils, again, the very low cation exchange, it's possible that the Roundup, glyphosate, can actually wash through the soil before it becomes inert and begin to impact on waterways. So, example of why CEC is an important feature. There's a nasty little herbicide called atrazine, which is heavily used by farmers. It works really well. The problem you'll find is, especially in rapidly developing areas in the Midwest, is that atrazine can stay in the soil for a number of years as an active piece. So if you're buying soil or you're planting soil on a property that's just coming out of corn harvest for a couple of years, you may find that soil is having an impact on the plant because it's still got some active herbicide in it. Abandoned railroad right-of-ways and industrial sites, if there aren't weeds growing there, you're looking for some kind of herbicide. And the railroads used really intense herbicides in the past, and there's still plenty of railroad right-of-ways that aren't growing weeds on them because of the long-term residual impact. These herbicides can also move down deeper in the soil so that the grass on the surface does fine. We had a project, we planted trees in over an old abandoned right-of-way, and the trees grew fine for a while, and then they all started to die because the roots had finally reached the herbicides down in the lower part of the soil volume. A lot of discussion about hydrocarbons. You know, we've got runoff, we've got leaky gasoline from cars. The asphalt is a leaching material. I've searched the web, I've talked to people. I can't find any diseases or impacts of these relatively small amounts of hydrocarbons going into the soil as an impact on plants. Now, they have a big impact on fish, and we could have a big impact on humans, but not so much on plants. In fact, plants can actually begin to absorb and stabilize these pieces, these particular chemicals that are in the soil. Natural gas can kill trees very quickly, but it's not so much that the gas is killing the plant. What's happening is the gas is displacing the oxygen in the soil. So the plant is actually looking like it's running out of soil. It's kind of looking like a tree that's essentially in an inadequate root space because it is. The gas has displaced the oxygen, so that large soil volume this tree used to have it no longer exists. If you've got a project where there's large-scale spills or leaks or historic hydrocarbon storage, that's a totally different story, and you need to do a lot of testing for that. This is not something I would recommend you do by yourself. There are specialty soil testing services, different collection techniques, all sorts of things that have to be done differently when you're at the industrial level of a hydrocarbon spill. So just be aware that this is the time to call an expert. On the other hand, I always tell people to learn the different soil odors. And actually, if you look in the hydrocarbon testing protocol, smelling the soil, having the technician smell the soil is the first test that they tell you to do. And you can pick up the beginnings of hydrocarbons and a number of other chemicals in the soil simply by smelling them. And when you identify some odor that is totally foreign to you, that's, again, the time to probably call in an expert because you're probably way out of your league in what you've just run into. Excess calcium, particularly in arid zones, can cause the soil to calcify and turn rock-like. So there are these materials called caliche, calcified soils throughout the Southwest. On the left-hand side is a soil that had only been down for a few years and had already begun to calcify in the lower levels, and plants just couldn't penetrate below the first couple of inches into the soil because of the calcification of the soil. So that concludes the basic chemicals that I have time to talk about. Anytime you're working in an urban environment, if you touch the soil, please wash your hands really well. You never know what you're going to be running into, from dog urine to benzenes to all kinds of crazy stuff. Very important to keep your hygiene. I was going to talk just for a moment about phytoremediation. I'm going to quickly go through that because basically it's the realm of the expert. If you're thinking of doing phytoremediation, make sure you're talking to someone who knows how to do it. And I'm going to end on a collection of resources that I'm going to breeze through, and you can get these off of I think Lita's going to put this up. But some of the books that I use, this abiotic disorder of landscape plants shows you what the leaves look like in all different kinds of chemical things, chemical problems that you'll have with soil, the most common ones. And there are pictures of the leaves, and it's a very good way of trying to identify what you're into. The second book, Diseases of Trees and Shrubs, is also a really good photo book and can show you a look-alike problem. So say you have a particular issue, you want to know, is it a disease or is it a chemical thing? This first book will help tell you whether it's a chemical problem. The second book might let you know when you're getting into the world of a plant disease that looks like a chemical problem. So you can use these two books together. It's all really easily well laid out. You don't have to be a plant or disease expert to get in the ballpark and know whether you should be calling in the chemical expert or calling in the plant disease expert. My book talks about this to some degree. There is a really good little agronomy handbook by A&L Labs that's only $15 that tells you how to interpret or helps you to interpret the testing results that you're getting from their lab. Phil Krall's book has got some really good sections on chemicals in soil, and even though it's the 1992 book, the chemistry hasn't changed. Note that he's got two other books out, but the first book, this one that I'm showing you, Urban Soil and Landscape Design, is where all of the data that I'm describing is, and the first book is designed to support the second two books. All three books are excellent, but for chemistry, you want to get the first one. And finally, good old Ray Wiles, The Nature and Properties of Soil. Tons and tons of stuff. You can dive into that 5-pound tome and spend the rest of your career trying to figure it out. But when you need a little particular piece of information, it's well referenced and indexed so you can get to the part that you need. Finally, you got to have a soil auger. Please buy a soil auger. Use it. It's the only way you can stick your finger in the soil and begin to get soil samples from deep enough in the soil to begin to test some of these things. I think every landscape architect should own and use this particular tool. So that ends. We've got a few minutes for questions. Sorry, Lita, that I went a little over, but you warned me.
No problem, Jim. Thank you for that great presentation. And yeah, the questions are starting to come in. So if you have the time, maybe we can stay on a little longer than planned so we can get to some of them. Okay.
Certainly.
So you mentioned a bunch of different ways of addressing trees and plants that have been impacted by salts, and obviously, budgets for tree care are a challenge, across the country and internationally. So our first question is from someone who works for the Ministry of Transportation in Ontario in Canada. She writes, we have thousands of kilometers of highways, all of which are impacted by salt. Would we be better off concentrating on reducing soil compaction, altering pH, or something else entirely to try to improve plant survivability?
Wow. Tough. It's a tough problem, mainly because you'd want to do all of those things. I think that assuming that you're using a list of reasonably salt-tolerant plants, which in Ontario is a very short list, I would work on compaction next. I've always believed that compaction is our biggest problem, and then work on good nursery practices second. So you're getting healthy trees up and running. It seems pretty clear from looking at the experience in Toronto last winter that once you get the tree established, it's doing much better, less likely to have winter problems. Similar species, old trees, new trees. The new trees always look worse. So you want to get them up and running as fast as you can. So good getting rid of compaction and really focusing on nursery problems would be the two areas where you could have the biggest impact for the least amount of money.
Great, thank you. All right, let's see. Sorry, the questions are coming in fast. All right, so earlier in your presentation, you showed a site that had salt damage from the water, and you were comparing areas with curbs and no curbs. Were those photos from a winter city where trees are dormant at that time of year?
Yeah, so all of the snow, the pictures where I was talking about salt, waterborne salt, are all areas in the northern part of the country where the trees are dormant. I don't have a lot of experience with conifers. I know that conifers typically have a lot more problems with salt spray but I don't have a good experience with the salt in the water. That's where I'm assuming that the question is maybe heading to conifers or might be heading toward the southwest.
Yeah, we do also have a question about evergreen trees as to whether some of the techniques you discussed here, particularly flushing, would work the same way.
Yeah, and I don't, the whole thing about flushing is something that's talked about in the literature and talked about amongst arborists as a good idea, but I can't find anybody I can't find a good study, and maybe I haven't looked hard enough, where somebody actually tried it and said, does it work? My guess is that a lot of the damage happens fairly early. It's the salt contact on the outer surfaces of the twigs that causes the problem. I know that, for example, pine trees in my part of the world, eastern white pine, which is particularly susceptible, if we have a heavy salt spray year, those trees start looking bad pretty soon. in the after the winter's over. As soon as it starts warming up, those needles turn brown. So I think that damage happens pretty quick.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about organic matter in soil. One person is wondering, given that organic matter, or organic material, I should say, absorbs winter-applied salts as well as calcium carbonate present in irrigation water, would you recommend a less organic soil in tree pits?
My thought on organic matter is that I think we put too much compost in the soil as opposed to organic matter. And that's a whole nother half-hour lecture to talk about why there's a difference. One of the ideas that I have is, especially for salt, would be that we would put down mulch in the late part of the growing season, in the fall, over some of these trees. Maybe put it down on top of a piece of filter cloth, and then in the spring come and take all that material away. The filter cloth would be essentially to facilitate removing the mulch, to allow us essentially to take that mulch and compost it further. It'll hold an awful lot of salt. Now, I'm not talking about chunky, barky mulch, but in order to hold salt, it's going to have to be a pretty fine, well-composted mulch to begin with. But I think you could then compost it and flush the salt out of it with enough time. But that would have to be a yearly thing, so I couldn't imagine doing it to all the roads in Ontario, but you might do it on Bloor Street in Toronto, for example.
Mm-hmm. Given everything you talked about in today's webinar, do you think stormwater bioswales and other vegetated BMPs along urban streets with high salt use should still be recommended?
I think that we need to investigate that. It's one of the many questions that I think we're ahead of ourselves on stormwater management on many fronts, and this is one of them. We know that many of these plants are pretty salt tolerant, especially plants. I mean, you can find in any niche trees or grasses or whatever a collection of very salt tolerant plants. But at the same time, these bioretention swales are designed to flush really quickly. In fact, I think they flush too quickly. So it may be that these high sand soils simply aren't going to hold enough salt to be a problem. The Toronto experience and the Chicago experience is really good last year, where we had an opportunity to try to figure out, how much of that problem was salt and how much of it was cold tolerance and how much it was something else. We just aren't doing the research to figure that out yet.
Toward the end of your presentation, you mentioned that oil and gasoline tend to not harm plants typically. So why does everybody talk about runoff from parking lots as being so bad and so prevalent?
That's one of those myths. I can't find any examples of where this actually causes problems in the levels that we normally get off of parking lots. And it's part of those broad statements that landscape architects and other people in the environment make that don't have any foundation. One of my favorites is that street lights harm trees. And people all over the place constantly say that. I find it written in many, many reliable reference books where actually the research says the opposite. So we need to be more rigorous if we're going to call ourselves a profession that's about the environment and about sustainability. We better make sure that when we say something, we know what the reference is, and that we have good foundation for saying what we're saying.
Mm-hmm. We have a number of questions coming in about search methods for finding pH-tolerant and salt-tolerant plants by region. Do any of the resources that you mentioned at the end of your presentation cover that?
Michael Durr's books, which if you are in the middle latitude, so say probably southern Canada down to Georgia and east to the Rockies, are pretty good on almost all the plants that we would use. And he's very, in his book, you go to the culture section of the description, and that's where you'll find out all the issues with soil. I don't know why he just didn't say soil, but he didn't. And I think that the other regional sources are I don't work outside of Michael Durr's region, so I haven't taken the time to look at tropicals or California plants or Arizona plants. But I know that you get your local sources. If they talk about soil, good. If they don't, go to your local extension. Go to Good Gardeners. You may have to find that information on your own for a particular plant, but it's there. Ed Gilman's web piece on plants. I think it's Ed Gilman is the one who did that. Is really good on more southern plants. There's a web piece, and I think it's a Gilman piece that has lots of information about plants. The web has gotten a lot better in the last couple of years on information about plants. You can go on, you just type in the name of the plant, and you'll get a USDA description of it almost every time you do that, a whole fact sheet just on that one plant.
And to clarify, Jim, which Michael Durr book are you referencing?
Well, the Manual of Woody Landscape Plants, which was his original book. It's now in its 6th edition and is 4 inches thick.
So light
good
reading.
For arm exercise.
Okay, well let's go to our last question, since I know we've gone over time here. In soil test readings, is there a good range to target for estimated nitrogen release, or is it tied directly to the organic percentage?
It's always tied directly to the organic, and I would use that A&L book. The good, your better labs, if you ask them for recommendations, will use that number to determine how much nitrogen you should put down. But the problem is that they're talking about all the amount of nitrogen you should put down is in almost all soil labs is based on crop production, nursery production, but they never talk about maintenance levels. And I think we could use a lot less nitrogen than we're putting down. A forest soil, for example, produces about 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet of area per year. That's natural forest. I have never seen a nitrogen recommendation at 1 pound. It's always higher. So I might just start with 1 pound of nitrogen per year unless I've got some really good reason to go above that.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for attending today. A link, the recording of this webinar will be sent out to everyone later this afternoon, and it'll also be posted to the DeepRoot YouTube channel. You can find more information about us on our website or our blog. Jim also has a website now. It's jamesurban.net, so please feel free to check that out. Jim, thank you for taking the time to speak to us today.
My pleasure, as always.